Gunpowder Plot, and as we have been saying, this year marks the 400th anniversary of this particular plot. First of all, we'll turn to the Word of God and we'll read one verse out of 2 Kings chapter 17 and the verse 39. 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 39. This passage brings us into the days of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah being a wonderful king in the nation of Judah, always reminded people of important words, and I don't think there are many more important words than what we have in verse 39 of 2 Kings chapter 17. But the Lord your God ye shall fear, and he shall deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies. So the subject tonight, the Gunpowder Plot. Remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot, runs the old and the very familiar rhyme. Now, while we don't actually light in our country too many bonfires over here on the 5th of November anymore, and while we don't have fireworks on that particular night either, to remind us of this Guy Fawkes night, it's totally different in England. In many of the towns and the villages in England, you would, even if you were about there on that night, the 5th of November, find on the top of one of the bonfires what they call a makeshift guy, after Guy Fawkes, of course. A figure that's been stuffed with straw or some other material, and he's just waiting to be incinerated on the top of the bonfire. But why? Why is this day remembered at all? Most school children would be able to give the answer that, well, we remember this day because Guy Fawkes tried to burn up the Houses of Parliament, and that's what we are commemorating here. And this is true. Tonight we want to not merely tell the story of the Gunpowder Plot. It was originally known, whenever it was launched back there in 1605, as the Powder Treason. But not just tell the story, we want to get a sense of scale on the plot, and get the enormity of the plot into view, and then draw a couple of up-to-date lessons as to what we can learn from the plot in the days in which we live. First of all, let's consider some background. The historian J.A. Wiley, and I would heartily recommend any of his writings, Wiley said, and he was talking about the conditions during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, it was now becoming clear to the popish powers, and most of all to the reigning Pope, Pius V, that the Reformation was centring itself and drawing to a head in England. That all the several countries of the Reformation, France, Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, were sending each its special contribution to form a more consolidated and a more perfect Protestantism than existed anywhere else. And so we have come on just about 50 years from our brother Ralph Obadell was talking about just a few moments ago, whenever under the reign of Mary we had all of those martyrs so mercilessly burned. Under the reign of Elizabeth, the Reformation was really taking root, and all of the work that had gone on in the other parts of Europe, they were bringing a lot of people, a lot of resources, a lot of material, a lot of scholarship to England. And that, as is the quote here, was where the Reformation was centering itself and drawing to a head. England was the key place. So as far as Rome was concerned, we need to change our focus. They must crush heresy in its head. That is, we must stamp it out in England. The quotation goes on to say that when Great Britain would be subjugated, the revolt of the 16th century, in other words, the Reformation, would be at an end. So we're talking about the Pope versus the Queen. Some popes, Pope Paul IV and Pius IV, tried the patient approach, and they came up to Queen Elizabeth I, and they wanted to put the arm around her shoulder and welcome her back and cajole her into the papal fold. When these popes found that that didn't work, then we have another pope, Pope Pius V, and he decides, well, I've run out of patience here, so he excommunicates Elizabeth on the 3rd of May, 1570. By this act of excommunication, It meant that he was declaring that Elizabeth was no longer the rightful Queen of England. And he was releasing everybody in the country, all of her subjects, he was releasing them from giving allegiance unto Elizabeth. Now, it wasn't that Catholics in England at the time really needed any excuse. Some of them had never given their support to Queen Elizabeth. They had always believed that Mary, the Queen of Scotland, Queen of Scots, was the rightful heir to the English throne. We were told back then that Jesuits poured into England from schools out on the continent. Roman Catholic priests with catechisms, helped by those seminary-trained assassins with daggers, could not wait for the nation to revert to popery through a sustained campaign of instruction and perversion, and so they plunged into plot after plot after plot, and I emphasise it rightly here, to overthrow Elizabeth and the Protestant authority in the country. Dating from the issue of this papal bull that excommunicated Elizabeth out of the church, the history of England is a continuous record of murder attempts. Attacks were launched from inside the country and from outside the country, and inevitably, no matter where the attacks were originating from, you would have had the Jesuits heavily involved. We could list a lot of plots. Rodolphi's plot, for example, in 1572. Another one, Edmund Campion's plot in 1580. Followed by Somerville's plot in 1583. They're coming thick and fast, as you can see. Parry's plot in 1584. Then Throgmorton's plot, 1584 as well. And then Babington's in 1586. Now, let me talk a little bit about Babington's plot, because this was one of the most dangerous conspiracies hatched against the life and the throne of Elizabeth I. It began rather predictably with a Roman Catholic priest out of the Roman Catholic seminary at Reims, and he was John Ballard. The plot spread to take in men from a lot of respectable families in England who would have been sympathetic to Roman Catholicism, one of whom was Anthony Babington, and therefore the plot takes its name after him. It spread out again, and it pulled in more people of yet higher rank and of greater influence, so that we have involved Philip the King of Spain, he's weighing in. We've got the Guises, who were in charge of France at the time, and they're weighing in and involved in the plot. We have the Pope, and he's backing it as well. And up in Scotland, the Queen, that many Catholics in England felt we want to be reigning over us, Mary, Queen of Scots herself, was heavily involved in the Babington plot. The plan was this: we'll go in there, assassinate Elizabeth, summon the Roman Catholics in England to arms, get a foreign army to come in, land on the coast, besiege and sack every city that resists it, raise Mary, Queen of Scots onto the throne, and establish the Roman Catholic religion in England. Mary paid for being involved in this plot with her life. She was beheaded at Fotheringay Castle in the year 1587. But within 1 year of the execution of Mary Stuart and the other Babington plot conspirators, a really mammoth attempt was launched to topple Elizabeth from her position of power in England, and this was the Spanish Armada. Meekeren says, the Catholic king had finished such a mighty navy as never the like before that time sailed upon the ocean sea. The Armada, just to give you some idea of the strength of it, comprised 130 vessels in total, and 64 of these would have been huge galleons. They had 8,000 sailors on board these vessels, and 2,088 galley slaves were there for the rowing purposes. It brought in 20,000 soldiers, 2,650 pieces of weaponry or heavy ordnance. The ships were lined with planks that were 4 feet in thickness, and so they were saying, you'll not be able to penetrate the kind of defences that we have, and the English fleet will be no match for us. And of course it came with all the papal blessing that you would expect. The Pope, having cursed Elizabeth, blessed this enterprise to overthrow Elizabeth. And something I find very interesting, the Pope promised that he would pay 1,000,000 crowns towards the expenses of the Armada. But whenever this mighty fleet was dismembered, with the colossal loss of human life, never mind all of the shipping, the Pope refused to hand over even a single ducat. Not a penny would come from him now. He said to them, quite plainly, "You haven't advantaged me anything. And what good are your ships when they're dying at the bottom of the sea? Why should I pay?" The destruction of the Spanish Armada marked the end of these Roman Catholic plots against Elizabeth's life. Now, it didn't go past unpunished. No government could allow people to rise up within it and hatch plot after plot after plot and not take a resolute stand against them. Their very future is under threat. And to the Tudor state, all Catholics in the country were potential traitors. They were forbidden to hear Mass. Baptisms and marriages were banned among the Catholic people. Those Catholics who refused to attend the Church of England services, they called them recusants, were to be heavily fined for their non-attendance, and Catholic priests were basically chased out of the country. In the year 1603, we have the end of an era. Elizabeth, Queen of England, after a long reign, 45 years on the English throne, was dying. Pope Clement VIII wasn't going to miss a parting shot at her, and he sent over 2 apostolic bulls, that's just parchments, writings, with his special imprimatur upon it, to Jesuit leader in England, Henry Garnet, and he talked about that miserable woman, that's Elizabeth, and he said she must be replaced by a monarch in the country who was going to promote the Roman Catholic faith. Now, Elizabeth's successor, they did go up to Scotland for him. He was then James VI of Scotland, and he happened to be as well the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, that the Catholics wanted to have on the throne in previous years, that queen who had been executed in 1587 on Elizabeth's orders because of her involvement in the Babington plot. Whenever the Catholics in England saw that, yes, the new king was going to be James VI of Scotland and James I of England, he would be, they were very excited. Rumours suggested that James would have been more warmly disposed towards Catholics than the dying Queen Elizabeth. After all, James had a wife, got her from Denmark, Queen Anne of Denmark, and she had very strong Catholic tendencies. James himself at this stage would have been making all the right sympathetic noises. So the early signs are encouraging. And upon James' accession to the throne, as James I of England, this new king, he ended all of these fines that were imposed upon Catholics if they didn't go to the Anglican services. He looked out a couple of chief Catholic sympathisers within the country, and he elevated them to high posts of privilege within the land. And this relaxation of things, this removal of many of the bans that had been imposed upon them, led to considerable growth among the number of people who professed themselves to be visible Catholics. However, we read in the Bible about the sow that is washed, returning from her wallowing in the mire. And just in the year that Queen Elizabeth died, 1603, in July of that year, 2 small Catholic plots against James are hatched. Now, although a lot of the Catholics in the country of England professed that they were horrified, they were all tainted by the threat of treason that had come up again. At the Hampton Court Conference in January of 1604, James stood up and he expressed hostility against the Catholics so that he could curry favour with the strong Puritan party in the country at that time. In February of that year, he publicly announced that he had an utter detestation of Catholicism. And within days, all of the priests and all of the Jesuits had been expelled, and these fines were reintroduced. Now, the Catholics, as you could well imagine, would have been bitterly disappointed. But most of them, they were prepared to swallow these fines being imposed upon them again, and they were happy enough to live double lives as best they could. But this passive approach, taking things lying down, did not suit everyone. Another plot was hatched, and you can well anticipate the name of it. It was the Gunpowder Treason and Plot, or the Powder Treason. Let me introduce you to a number of the leading figures in this plot. Robert Catesby. He was a member of an old and a rich Catholic family in England, and he was very devout. His father and his uncle was Sir Thomas Tresham, had been imprisoned and fined because they had harboured, back in the days of Elizabeth the Queen, the rebel Jesuit priest, Edmund Campion, from the Campion Plot. He was trying to fulfil the Pope's wish and desire as expressed in the Pope's bull against Elizabeth and see her taken off the throne and assassinated. Between 1581 and 1605, Tresham was forced to pay £8,000 in penalties, and if we could update that into today's values, that's about £4 million. Now, the fines were very hurtful, but men like Tresham and the father of Catesby, they were happy enough still to pay them, and they weren't looking for a violent end to the reign of the king. They remained loyal. But some of the younger generation, like Robert Catesby here, they were fretting. They were frothing with rage. During the long reign of Queen Elizabeth I, Robert Catesby became an anti-Protestant of an irreconcilable character. Hatred filled his head and filled his heart. The Gunpowder Plot wasn't his first attempt to overthrow the monarch, the Protestant ruler in the kingdom. The last physical threat upon the life of the elderly Queen Elizabeth had occurred back in 1601. It was the Essex Rebellion, and it was led by a Protestant, the Earl of Essex. He was helped by Robert Catesby. Catesby was wounded in the fighting, then he was captured, then he was imprisoned, and he was fined almost £2,700. And so whenever that was added, this £2,700 to his other debts that he had now inherited from his father, his total debt had spiralled to £12,000. £6 million in today's terms. Also, Catesby had been involved with another plot. He was trying to encourage a Spanish invasion to come over into England, and he refused the oath of supremacy. When he was at university, it meant that he had to go through university study there and get no benefit, because he had to leave without his degree, because he wouldn't take the oath of supremacy to the Queen. But Catesby was the leader of the Gunpowder Plot. Not Guy Fawkes, as is commonly supposed. It was Robert Catesby who was the originator of the plot. He was its mastermind. He was the charismatic leader of this, what became a tightly knit band of plotters. He was a guy who had a lot of personal magnetism. And that would have been crucial in the days of going out there and recruiting and then leading along his small band of conspirators. His first recruits were John Wright and Thomas Wintour. But we'll not talk a lot about them at the moment. We want to talk more about Thomas Percy. He was a second cousin of a very influential figure in England, of the 9th Earl of Northumberland. Percy would have worked for the Earl. In 1591, Percy married into a prominent Catholic Yorkshire family. That was the Wright family. And his wife Martha, she had a couple of brothers, John and Christopher. They had been involved also in the Essex Rebellion back in 1601, and they also enlisted as some of the main conspirators in the Gunpowder Plot. Although Thomas Percy would have been known as a gentleman pensioner, there was one thing that he longed to do: get in there close to Queen Elizabeth, or rather, get in there close to King James, and murder him with his own hands. And there were many occasions, due to his circulating in the higher echelons of society through his relationship with the Earl, many occasions where he came close to James I. Picture of the three conspirators, or those acting their role, three main ones. We've got Catesby there. on the left, and then on the right we've got Percy, and in the middle, the person we're now going to talk about for a little time, Guy Fawkes. Fawkes was educated in York, born there as well, went to school with the Wright brothers, who we have just mentioned, and it's amazing how these guys get together in later life and are all implicated in this particular plot. Now, Guy Fawkes would have been a tall and handsome fellow whenever the plot was beginning. He was 33 years of age. He was a professional soldier, and at that time he would have been very much in his fighting prime. He wasn't a soldier, though, in the English army. He again was a devout Catholic, like Robert Catesby. Also, like Catesby, he felt that he was unable to swear the oath of supremacy introduced by Elizabeth in 1559 that said that she is the supreme head of the Church of England and the Pope is not. Instead of fighting for the English army, Fawkes went over to Flanders and joined the Spanish army. That at that time would have been the best organised and equipped in Europe. He served there in the ranks of the Spanish army for 10 years, mostly fighting in the Netherlands and trying his best to advance the Spanish Catholic cause. After 10 years, Guy Fawkes is brought into this conspiracy, largely because he's been out of England for a long time, and during the IRA campaign they were always very fond to recruit who they termed as lily-whites. People that sort of just appeared out of nowhere that they'd no suspicions about. Guy Fawkes would have been one of these lily-whites, having been out of the country for so long. His face wasn't going to be quickly recognised by the network of spies that Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, who was the new king's chief administrator, he would have been sending these spies out just to keep tabs on what was happening in the country. But also, Fawkes was a very enticing member of the band, in that he had this ability, through serving in the Spanish army, where he learned the art of mining, tunnelling underneath the enemy positions in order to destroy them with explosives. He knew how to handle gunpowder, an explosives expert. Where have we heard about that recently? And of course, the handling of gunpowder was so central to this plan, as the name, of course, suggests. As these fellows went along and they were waiting for Parliament to convene, Parliament was delayed, so they spread the net a little wider, and just before the plot was about to be executed, they had 30 prominent members, main conspirators here. They brought in a couple of high-profile characters, and we'll not go into their names because we'll have just far too many names here to even think about. But the first meeting of these conspirators took place on the 20th of May 1604. Robert Catesby was there, of course, chief position at the table, joined by the friends we've mentioned, Thomas Wintour, James Wright, Thomas Percy. They met together in the Duck and Drake at the Strand in London, and the fifth person around the table was Guy Fawkes. But the Parliament postponed now to the 5th of November 1605. Over the intervening year, the number of plotters would have gradually increased. And the one thing about them was that they were all, with one exception, a man by the name of Thomas Bates, they were all people of standing within the community. They were gentlemen of position in the country. Although Bates, though he was a servant of Robert Catesby, he had a servant under him as well, so he wasn't exactly down on his uppers either. Let's think of the plot. All over the previous succession of plots, the Throgmorton's plot and the Babington conspiracy and even the Spanish Armada, there was one thing that all of these plotters were looking for, and that was the assassination of the ruling Protestant monarch. That was central to their planning. Let's kill the Queen in the case of Elizabeth, or let's, later on, kill the King in the case of James. In this particular plot, the Gunpowder Plot, Robert Catesby went far beyond the notion of just assassinating the King. The basic aim of the Gunpowder Plot was to blow up the upper houses of Parliament, the House of Lords, during the ceremony of the state opening of the Parliament. So they'd have got all the main people in the country into the House. Up it would have gone, and the rulers would have been taken out in the one blast. They're targeting King James, his wife, Queen Anne of Denmark, their son and the heir, Prince Henry. The Archbishop of Canterbury would have been there with all of his senior bishops. The senior law lords would have been there for the opening of Parliament. The Privy Councillors would have been there. And we know who's just been elected one of those. Virtually every member of the British landed aristocracy, all the principal gentlemen of England, would have been present at that opening of Parliament. So it's no exaggeration to say that had the plot been successful, the already foul waters of the Thames would have run red with the blood of an entire ruling class. I was interested to read a quotation by Antonia Fraser in the Daily Mail not so long ago. She herself is a Roman Catholic. She has written a book about the Gunpowder Plot back in 1995. It had the subtitle Terror and Faith in 1605. She said, had they managed it, the repercussions of this massive explosion, considered by some to be the world's first planned terrorist outrage, would have been even more devastating than the attacks on the Twin Towers in September 2001. She explains why. In all probability, the death toll in 1605 would have been lower than in the attack on the Twin Towers, but it is the identity and status of those who would have died that resonates down the centuries. And in that case, with all of the ruling elite taken out at the one stroke, this would have been worse than 9/11. They were not only wanting to take out the ruling class, but they wanted to install a Roman Catholic regime in the country. The plan of the plotters was that whenever the Gunpowder Plot would succeed, the powder be exploded, Parliament blasted to pieces. While Guy was blowing up the Parliament, most of the others had another stage in the plot to fulfill. They were going to launch a rebellion across the country and install a Roman Catholic government. So, Guy's down there in the cellars, he's blowing up the Parliament. Most of the others involved in the plot, the other 12, well, they had a couple of in London, so another 10 or so of them, they would be making their way up into the Midlands, into the likes of Warwickshire, etc., and they were going to kidnap a young princess. It was the eldest daughter of James I, Princess Elizabeth. They knew that she was staying in Coombe Abbey near Coventry at the time. They wanted her because they were going to set her on the throne. Even though she was only 9 years of age, they would have a puppet queen. While she's sitting there as the figurehead, they would be pulling all the strings and dictating all the policy. She would be under the control of a Catholic protector, perhaps that 9th Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, that we have mentioned already. In due course, this earnestly Protestant princess, as she was, and very pretty girl we're told as well, she'd be transformed into a Catholic queen. The kingdom, it would be cemented for Catholicism by a marriage of convenience. How lovely. To one of those Catholic princes that would be most eligible over in Spain or France. Just to get their way, they would certainly be able to get one of those fellows over that they would deem eligible. Didn't matter if she liked him, it just meant it processed the Catholic cause for them. Shortly afterwards, the conspirators, they leased a small house in the heart of Westminster. This is to get the plot underway. It was called the Vineyard House. There was a little chamber in the house that came close onto the House of Lords that they wanted, of course, to fall. Their plan was that they were going to dig and do a lot of digging here, make an underground passage. Isn't it wonderful how skills that have been well honed over centuries are passed on down through into the Maze prison, for example? And we have them digging their tunnels again. History has a wonderful way of repeating itself, an expertise of transferring itself from one hand and mind down to another. So their thought is, we'll construct here an underground passage underneath the House of Lords. We'll dig and we'll dig until we have that. We'll fill it up with gunpowder. We'll blow it up at the appropriate moment when the king and his family and the others are assembled for this opening of Parliament. They began the work on the house in the cellar on the 11th of December 1604, and they toiled on until they came to the heavy stone foundation of the House of Lords. They had to take a break. The work was not resumed until January, but at the end of a further 2 months, they hadn't got any more than halfway through the wall. It was then that they heard a little bit of news that really encouraged them. There was a cellar that was directly under the House of Lords, available to let. Thomas Percy hired it, as though it was going to be for his own use and business. They called off their excavation work and the work of this tunnel, and they promptly moved a huge collection of gunpowder, 36 barrels, adding up to about a ton of gunpowder, into the vault. They covered it over with firewood, placed it in the care and charge of Guy Fawkes, and he was operating under the name John Johnston. Many of the plotters then left London, and they didn't return until late in October. They must have been really, turning their hands round, rubbing it in glee, and thinking things are moving really nicely for us here. Everything seemed to be in order. Even the matter of absolution had been taken care of, as eternal damnation awaited those who killed unlawfully. Robert Catesby and others in this conspiracy band, they had gone to the priest and had sought absolution in advance. However, on the night of the 26th of October 1605, one small but significant event meant that the Gunpowder Plot ended in failure. It all revolved around a little piece of parchment, a letter of warning. William Parker, who was Baron Monteagle, was a Catholic gentleman in the country who had been involved in plots against the Queen in the past. The Essex Rebellion he was involved in, and also trying to stir up interest in Spain to come over and invade England. But whenever James I came to the throne of England, Monteagle decided, I'll knuckle down here, and he conformed to the Church of England, and he was summoned eventually to the House of Lords as a member of Parliament. How things go in circular motion yet again. The former plotter, out for the blood of the Queen, is now a peer in the House of Lords. Sitting at dinner on the 26th of October in the evening time, he is just outside of London, and a letter of warning is given to him by one of the servants. My lord, it began, out of the love that I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift of your attendance at this Parliament. For God and man have concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance, it said, of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. Now this was a classic, the big moment for Lord or Baron Monteagle. Having been involved in these previous plots, having succeeded to a degree to wash his hands of them now and be reinstated within the country to a high position, one of the peers in the Parliament, but he felt that, well, here is my big chance. And he takes the letter and he gives it to Robert Cecil, who's the Earl of Salisbury, who's putting out all the spies through London and through England to check on the welfare and the safety of the king. brings a letter to Robert Cecil. Robert Cecil in turn shows it to James I when some days later, on the 31st of October, he returned to England. Despite the rather cryptic phrasing in the letter, James and his officials decided that this terrible blow that was going to be delivered from an unseen quarter was going to be an explosive one. Cecil, Lord Salisbury, ordered Westminster to be searched. And they went below the House of Lords, found when he went down there a suspiciously large pile of firewood in one of the cellars, and they also found hanging about in the vicinity Guy Fawkes, and he was dressed in his traditional black cap and cloak. He's waiting in the cellar, of course, so that he could ignite the gunpowder with that slow match or the fuse. And Hawkes said, well, you know, this wood, it all belongs to a friend of mine, and he named Thomas Percy. Now, Percy was this Roman Catholic, the second cousin to the 9th Earl of Northumberland. Thomas Percy was the guy who was in circulation all around the place in the high echelons of society. And being a Catholic, they thought, right, something is up here. Why does this man have a huge pile of firewood below the House of Lords? And we're finding it here the day before Parliament is opened. Now, they didn't find the gunpowder there and then. They came back later on the next night, or early the next morning, and they found it when he started to take down all the firewood, and out comes the 36 barrels of gunpowder. So they arrest Guy Fawkes, and they send out a warrant for the arrest of Thomas Percy. You can imagine they're brought to interrogation. That is, Guy Fawkes appears before the chief interrogators in the country, and he's saying all the time that, oh, well, I'm John Johnson, servant to a master, Thomas Percy. And he was able to stick to this cover story for 24 hours. But then the king signed a warrant that authorised them to use gentle tortures first, and then by degrees move on to the worst kind of torture. And so the plot quickly unravelled. Guy Fawkes told them the other conspirators, their names, told them how they'd gone, got absolution from the priest, how he had made and the others had made an oath at Mass that they would not reveal each other's names. But all of this information under torture came trundling out of Fawkes's lips. The plot had well and truly failed. But let's consider some vital points about the aftermath. Because despite the fact that news got up to those who were circulating around Warwickshire and were about to get the 9-year-old princess and install her as the puppet queen, they didn't get to her, by the way. They were foiled in that attempt as well. But although the news got to these men, the gunpowder has not gone off. The plan has been rumbled. Guy Fawkes is now in custody. He's been interrogated. The letter has come on the scene and ruined everything for us. Though the news travelled up into the Midlands, Robert Catesby refused to give up. He and those who were with him went round and they stole horses, plundered weapons. For 3 days they galloped along, Thomas Percy himself, Thomas Wintour and the others, and they went from one Catholic safe house to another one, and they were still desperately trying to drum up support for this Catholic rebellion in Warwickshire and in Staffordshire. By now, of course, they're wanted men. People are out hunting for them. On the 7th of November, 2 days after the day when the gunpowder should have gone off, they reached Holbetch House in Staffordshire. They decided that of all the houses we know, the Catholic safe houses, this would be the most fortified, and we'll take our final stand here, and, well, we can more easily defend this part of the property than we can some of the other places we've been at. When they arrived in Holbetch House, they found that their gunpowder was soaking. Would you believe it? They laid it in front of the fire to dry. And that was a very bad move. But then there are guys who over the years have had bombs go off in their own faces that they were setting for others. And the gunpowder went off in Holbetch House. blew clean from the grate, blinded one of them, wounded a few more of them, and it meant that they were rather more incapacitated than what they wanted to be whenever the big showdown was going to take place. And this came quickly, because in the shape of 200 men led in by Sir Richard Walsh, the High Sheriff of Worcester, these people arrived at Holbeach House on the morning of 8th of November. The battle was short. Catesby, Percy, and both Wright brothers were killed at the scene. In fact, Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy, how unfortunate, were killed by the same musket round. And those Wright brothers, it should be said, 20 years earlier, they had attended the same St. Peter's School in York, along with Guy Fawkes. They died at Holbeach House as well. Thomas Wintour, another of the number, was hit by a crossbow bolt in the shoulder, and 4 other conspirators were wounded but taken alive. Only a few now remained at large, and that wasn't for long. In fact, by December, only one, Robert Wintour, was still free, and by January of the next year, 1606, even he too had been captured. One big fact to emerge from these men whenever the screws are being applied and torture methods are being put on them as well, and information is coming out of them, was the involvement of the Jesuits in the plan. Under interrogation, Bates admitted that he had confessed all of the details of the plot to the Jesuit priest, and he named him Oswald Teschemont. In fact, a carefully written chapter on the subject of the Gunpowder Plot appears in a book that was authored by a Roman Catholic priest, Ethelred Taunton, called The History of the Jesuits in London, published in 1901. And in his book he shows that the Jesuits were at the bottom of the whole conspiracy. They were agitating, they were pulling the strings, they were giving all the encouragement, all the support, they were covering the tracks. And even though it was fair to say that the general body of English Roman Catholics wanted nothing to do with this Gunpowder Plot at this time, the Jesuits were very happily and keenly involved. They took the plotters to the Tower of London. Francis Tresham, who seemed to have been the guy who passed the letter on to Lord Mounteagle, and who was one of the weakest plotters, the one whose nerve failed first. He came to the Tower and he died of illness, so they didn't really have too many to try at the end of the events. In January of 1606, the trials began. The Attorney General stood up and he very prominently blamed the Jesuits. Then he went on to describe the traditional punishment that is meted out to traitors in our country, and he described the process in detail of hanging and drawing and quartering, and I'm sure it must have been incredibly blood-chilling. 1 out of 8 of those who were on trial that day pleaded guilty, and he was the last of the 8 to be tried. But all were found guilty of high treason and executed in batches of 4. Guy Fawkes was incidentally the last of them to die, and maybe because his body had been more weakened than the others through torture, he had the good fortune to break his neck when he was being hanged. Henry Percy, the 9th Earl of Northumberland that we have mentioned, he was found guilty of complicity in the plot, fined a massive £30,000, imprisoned in the Tower of London until 1621. And he stayed there all that time. There was no early release or reduction of sentence. Mounteagle, because he had handed in the letter he had received, and that letter is kept now in the Public Records Office, he was rewarded handsomely in the country, and he had an annuity of about £700 a year, which was a massive figure back then. The Gunpowder Plot provoked the English government into a series of anti-Catholic measures in the country. They brought in a new act in 1606. They called it the Act for the Better Discovering and Repressing of Popish Recusants. It contained these words: Catholics, by the wicked and devilish counsel of Jesuits, seminaries, and other like persons, dangerous to the Church and State, are so far perverted in the point of their loyalties and due allegiance unto the King's majesty and the crown of England, as they are ready to entertain and execute any treasonable conspiracies and practices, as evidently appears by the more than barbarous and horrible attempt to have blown up with gunpowder the King, Queen, Prince, Lords and Commons in the House of Parliament assembled. And that act trundles on to quite a length. The same legislation enacted an oath of allegiance that all Catholics would be required to take, or they would suffer criminal penalties. New laws were passed preventing them from practising law, from serving as officers in the army or the navy, or from even voting in local or parliamentary elections. Recusancy fines for not attending the Church of England in their worship were set at £20 a month, and an additional clause was brought in that allowed the state to come in there and they could seize up to 2/3 of their lands if they continued to break the law at this point. On a broader level, the Gunpowder Plot proved to be the last gasp of active resistance against the King and the country. After this time, the Catholic population decided that let's lie low, let's be quiet. A lot of historians have come along and talked about exactly why the plot failed. And volume after volume has been trundled out over the years and written about events that conspired to make the plot a failure. Two very good reasons, I believe, they have hit on, and that would be one obvious one, the information leak. The plotters here would have been caught in a double bind of most early conspirators. In order to make their rebellion work, they had to spread the news about it. They had to involve a number of people that they trusted. But the more people who got to know about the plot, then the more likely it was that information was going to leak out. And with the letter, so it did. The other reason historians put the finger upon as to why the plot did not work was because the powder they had would not have blown. It was unusable. When it was moved to the Tower of London magazine after Guy Fawkes was caught, they discovered that the powder was decayed. That is, it had done what gunpowder always does when it's left to sit for far too long. It has separated into its component chemical parts, and therefore it had been rendered harmless. And so they say, these historians, that if Guy had been able to plunge in the torch with Parliament all seated and ready above him, all that would have happened would have been a little sparkler going on down there in the cellar. I don't altogether buy that. There's a lot of revision of history that goes on, and people bend over backwards to try and downplay the events. But let's not focus on an information leak as being the reason why it failed, or even unusable powder as to why it couldn't have succeeded anyway. We prefer to trace a higher hand at work. What about a providential God? Both these weaknesses, the information leak and the unusable powder, were overshadowed by what again historians describe as an accident of history. And that was the fact that the Parliament kept on being putting back and postponed to a later date. Originally, the Parliament was meant to have opened on the 3rd of October 1605, and it was only because in London at the time there were still the remaining traces of the bubonic plague. It made them feel it's very sensible here to hold on and put the opening of Parliament back for a month. So someone says, so much may hang upon the presence of a few plague bacilli in the right place. Had there been no plague in the capital in that summertime, Parliament would have been able to meet a month before in October when they decided to do it. Very probably when the gunpowder that was stored in the cellar there would have been still lethally effective, and arguably before one of the less discreet plotters had lost his nerve and began to talk and put it in letter format and given the letter of warning to Lord Mounting. Had there been no plague, they wouldn't have been troubled by an information leak, and there wouldn't have been any problem at all with that gunpowder. So in October 1605, King James, Queen Anne, both the Houses of Parliament would indeed have gone sky high, leaving the Catholic conspirators to seize the kingdom. This is nothing other than the hand of God. And over 5th of November we can write, providential intervention. Because what if the powder had gone up, and the Houses of Parliament had been devastated, and those who were in it? Well, the royal children would have been handed over to the Jesuits for their education. Charles I, one of the sons of James, and later to become king, was a rather weak kind of character, liked things that appealed to his eyes and senses. So the Romish ritual and everything else would have been very attractive, and was very attractive to him, and he would have been a classic Catholic convert. Not only that, but when he would have converted over to Catholicism, many of the subjects in the country would have followed his lead until Protestantism in the land of England would have become a minority. And before long, you know what would happen. They would withdraw toleration in future generations from them, just the way they did it in France, and then subjected the Huguenots to massacres. Ireland, of course, would have been rising up and enthusiastically clapping the fact that we've had a rebellion that has now succeeded in England, and we've a Catholic king that is on the throne. Scotland probably would have declared independence, and would have become for a time a refuge for England Protestants, but ultimately would have been conquered. Parliament would have been sufficiently compromised and neutered, so that the road to an absolute monarchy would have been taken in the country of England, and this time with the Catholic king on the throne, they would go after the model of France, or Spain, or Austria, and the Pope would have been an ultimate charge. But instead of that scenario, and thank God that did not develop, we have the survival of James I. And I have a lot of grave reservations about things that he did and policies that he introduced into the country, and also the king after him, Charles I, things that he did. While we stagger at some of the things that they were involved in, yet we welcome the fact that a lot of blessings came through James' reign. James was, under God and grace, enabled to make a lasting impression on church history. Commissioned a version of the Bible that was to become the standard text for more than 300 years, the King James Version that we adhere to and love. First printed it was in 1611, 6 years after the failed Gunpowder Plot. Because James survived and the Protestants were still in the ascendancy in the country, Puritan preachers were able to flourish. And look at the wealth of literature we have, books and everything else from these Puritan preachers we can access today. And to look further abroad, then, there was under James the beginning of empire, and he authorized what they called the Evangelistic Grant Charter to settle the colony of Virginia. Many blessings as a result of God's providential intervention. Encore is my final heading. As with much of history, the Gunpowder Plot carries a notable warning. Antonia Fraser, that I have already referred to, she had styled Guy Fawkes as a British Bin Laden. She makes the parallel that the Gunpowder Plotters were driven by hatred, exactly the same emotion that drove Muhammad Atta and his fellow hijackers to fly the planes and their terrified passengers into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. More recently, she says, and rightly so, these same dark forces drove Mohammed Sadiq Khan and his fellow suicide bombers to kill people making their way to London for work on the 7th of July this year. Isn't it rather ironic that those suicide bombers in July of this year originated from Yorkshire, where Guy Fawkes came from, where the two Wright brothers came from, where Thomas Percy came from? The evil of terrorism is very much still in our midst. But if we're looking for parallels with the Gunpowder Plot, then let's in closing think of a rather more direct parallel than the Islamic strikes. The Grand Hotel in Brighton, Tory Party Conference in 1984. Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the time, meeting there with her cabinets and the other members of the party. And Patrick McGee, IRA bomber, comes on the scene. And he almost succeeded in doing what he intended, to take the Prime Minister and her cabinet out. 3.5 weeks before the bombing, note the similarities as we go through. McGee had checked into the hotel. He'd come in under the fictitious name, not of John Johnson like Guy Fawkes, but Roy Walsh. He stayed there for a while, targeting the ruling class in the country. He stayed from 14th to the 17th of September. He primed a 20 to 30 pounds bomb that he hid in the bathroom wall with a timing device set for 24 days ahead. Fawkes had a long fuse, but it wasn't going to burn for 24 days. Just time enough for him to get out and away. And at 2:54 a.m. on the 12th of October, the bomb blasted a gaping hole through the facade of the hotel. Mrs. Thatcher at the time was in the hotel working on her conference speech, and although she and the cabinet escaped the blast, it left 5 people dead and 34 injured. McGee, Catholic terrorist, 1984 style, was sentenced in 1986. At his trial, the judge, Mr. Justice Bowden, recommended that he serve a minimum of 35 years, and he was rather satisfied, this judge, at the length of time that he felt that McGee was going to serve. He said, "You've intended to wipe out a large part of the government, and you nearly did. I must be grateful that in recent years legislators have raised the maximum sentence from a mere 20 years to life imprisonment for explosive offences." Put in prison in 1986. 35 years. On Tuesday, the 22nd of June, 1999, he walks free, under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. Patrick McGee had become eligible for an early release, having served only about a third of his sentence. How, in that final aspect, things have so changed. Every year on the 5th of November, we should remember this failed conspiracy against the monarchy. We should celebrate it as a decisive blow against terrorism that was brought about by the gracious deliverance of our God. Strange how, in a Catholic-dominated society in which we live today, it's Halloween that's celebrated here. But all the focus of attention is on, and you know the kind of celebrations we have in our city at Halloween. But the 5th of November comes and goes, and not a squeak. Let's keep it in mind, and let's bring to mind the words of 2 Kings 17:39. "But the Lord, your God, ye shall fear, and he shall deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies."